Hi, I'm Sean. Thanks for watching. Today, let's talk about the brain. Like most of the videos you've possibly maybe have seen, this video is going to be a bird's eye view. It won't get into too much detail, but there will be another video up and coming soon in the future. Where we're going to talk about trauma, and we'll get a little bit more, specific about the brain. But let's talk about the brain for today. So the brain's got a lot of functions, but just for our purposes, let's try to simplify it as much as we can. The basic function of the brain is to keep you alive and to conserve energy. That's pretty much it. We can go into a little more details, but keeping you alive and conserving energy is the biggest points that the brain is trying to do. A lot of times when we talk about the brain, we're thinking it's one thing, but in reality, it's kind of layered. It's not just one level. It's almost like it's got like 3 stories to it. So another way of looking at that is if you can imagine yourself, you got like 3 sonar systems or satellites throughout you. So what I mean by that is you got one satellite that's kind of focused on what's going on the inside. You got one satellite focused on what's on the outside. And I'll get to the third one in just a second. But pretty much the satellite on the inside of the sonar system is checking for basic things to make sure everything's okay and functioning on the inside. So some of those things is going to be like temperature, heartbeat, if you're thirsty, if you're hungry, kind of things like that. It's kind of like a little bit of a differentiation machine, but it just kind of scopes it out. It goes, all right, how's our breathing? How's our blood pressure? Are we thirsty? Are we hungry? How's our basic needs? What's going on in here? Then there's another one that kind of scopes on the outside. And both of these are kind of looking for threats, looking for things that the system doesn't like. So the one on the outside kind of scans. It kind of goes, all right, any threats in the environment? Do we have any animals around us or anything like that that we should be afraid of? Any people? Is the environment predictable? Is it okay? So these 2 systems communicate with each other. So if the inside feels like, hey, our heartbeat is kind of going a little bit high, it's beating kind of quick, it'll communicate with the upstairs and kind of go, hey, you got anything going on out there? And the outside will scan. And then we'll just say it goes, yes, found it, communicates it back and goes, there's a big bear out in the distance. We see it. We'll take care of it. Goes, thank you. Great chat. Sometimes though, it won't see something. And it'll kind of give back a message saying, I kind of don't see anything. Don't really know what's going on. We'll get into that a little bit later on. But you got one on the inside, scanning, heartbeat, thirst, hunger, temperature, everything all right. You got one scanning on the outside, and these 2 communicate with each other. Now you got this third satellite or sonar system. And what I mean by that is if the inside goes, all is well in here, upstairs goes, all is well over here too, then it kind of looks up and it scans one step even further. And what I mean by that is it looks at people around us to kind of see their reaction to situations. So our brain, it's inside, make sure we're okay, but it's also kind of social by design too, for survival purposes. Remember, keep us alive and conserve energy. So if everything's all right in here, there's this third satellite that kind of kicks up and goes, oh man, that person looks a little bit worried. Should I be worried as well? And it kind of like feeds off of each other. So everything all right in here, everything all right over here, boom, let's look up, everything all right over there. And these 3 kind of systems or layers constantly are communicating with each other. Up, down, middle, all throughout, looking for threats. And to keep going with it, so if the brain is designed to conserve energy and to keep you alive, one also way it kind of does this is through what we call predictability. So the brain wants to find patterns, both with us as well as the environment outside of us, to kind of foreshadow or to kind of like predict what's about to happen. Because if we can predict what's about to happen, we can prepare for it. And that way we can kind of conserve energy. So sometimes the brain does, it assumes and it judges. So I know that it's kind of sometimes don't judge or don't assume things about other people or about your environment and stuff. But the truth of the matter is we're designed to do those things. So in reality, it's about being mindful that we're doing it and being aware that we're doing that in order to kind of calm the brain and kind of choose a different path. But the brain predicts things by doing that. By predicting, by judging, it kind of looks for those sort of things. So without getting too off track, but if I'm designed to conserve energy and to keep you alive, and one of the ways I do that is to predict or find patterns in things, well, now we're getting into a little bit of a control factor, right? So if my outside of my environment is unpredictable, I will not feel safe. And I will sooner or later try to create a predictable situation among the things out there. What I mean by that is that now we're no longer looking for good or bad. All we are looking for is predictable. That's why at times, like, it might sound like a silly example, but let's say there might be other factors too, but like a kiddo doesn't turn in their homework and they're constantly getting yelled at or getting disciplined or managed. They're intentionally not turning in their homework sometimes because their brain is looking for predictability. I know what happens if I don't turn in my homework, but if I do, the world is a little bit less predictable for me. So sometimes what we view from the outside, from somebody else, is good or bad. That doesn't matter to the brain. The brain just sees predictable or not. And when it's predictable, it conserves energy and it has a little bit of more insight to attempt to keep us alive. So now you're starting to see why we have patterns. We have things that we do. Imagine a route that you take or a route that you take from house to home to work. If there's a traffic jam on the freeway and you got to take another route, you got to pay attention to that a little bit more, right? So if you're used to taking the same route from home to work every day, you've created what we call a predictable environment for yourself. So when you create a predictable environment, sometimes your brain is free to zone out and it kind of focuses on other things. But the minute that environment becomes unpredictable, a light is out, a tree's falling over, you got to get off the freeway or you got to take side streets. Now you got to kind of pay a little bit more attention. Now you got to use energy to create some sort of safety for yourself. So now we can see why the brain doesn't look at it as good or bad. It just looks at it as predictability is conserving energy, and that's what we're looking for is patterns. It doesn't matter to me if I'm taking a longer route to get to work and somebody says there's a shorter route. I'm still going to keep taking the longer route, even though to somebody else it's like, that's actually using more energy. But since it's predictable, it's using less energy. And that's how we sometimes fall into patterns as well. So if the brain is looking for predictability, now we can see how sometimes we can jump to conclusions. What I mean by that is, if we imagine the brain trying to predict what's going to happen before it actually happens, by gathering information from the past and anticipating what might happen, we can view this almost like a hologram being projected. What I mean by that is, as you're walking through your life, almost kind of like a video game, you have this hologram being projected in front of you. So you have this anticipation or what if or possibilities that might happen in assuming things. And then you have what's actually happening in front of you. And these two things kind of get blurred in between. So now it's difficult for us to tell reality from us assuming what might happen. So with those two things, with reality happening and then a hologram being projected in front of us and it kind of getting blurred and us not knowing the differences between them because the brain's trying to conserve energy, we can also see now how the brain has to and wants to know things. It doesn't like loose ends. Loose ends sometimes give us anxiety, and we'll get into that a little bit in another video. But unknowns, loose ends, things that are out of our control make us feel anxious. And when they're out of our control and they're unknown, we want to make it known. So sometimes my truth and your truth might be two different things, but it's very difficult at times for me to let go of my truth and accept yours, because that means it's untying, having an unknown, and then to grasp your truth. So even though sometimes to the outside, it's like, nope, that's not what's happening. This is my truth. Sometimes people hang on to their truths and we say that they're stubborn or whatever it may be, because it's almost like to them, it's life or death. You're asking my brain to not know something, and that takes a lot of energy for that to happen. But it's also a beautiful part of being human and to grow. So now that we've kind of talked about parts of the brain a little quickly, not in too much detail, just kind of like a bird's eye view, I'm just going to label a couple parts of the brain that we've already kind of discussed, but to give you a little bit more of a concept. So the two channels that I was referring to and stuff, what I was referring to is called the hypothalamus and the thalamus. Those are your two ways of kind of communication, your gatekeepers to your brain. Then the survival mechanism of the brain that kind of jolts and kind of says, get away from a situation, or scans more specifically in here, that's called the amygdala. We're going to get into that a little bit more in detail when we talk about trauma. But just generally speaking, the amygdala is that we've all kind of possibly heard it before, that it's responsible for that when you're afraid of something, for that you fight something, you run away, you freeze, or you might appease, you might bargain with it and stuff. But within that amygdala, there's also these other factors too that help close that loop of the brain too, which is sex, food, exercise. We'll get into those details a little bit more when we talk about trauma. But you got the thalamus and the hypothalamus, which is the communication centers, kind of going up and down, the gatekeepers, transferring the information back and forth. And then you also have your amygdala, which is kind of like the tower, kind of telling you, hey, something's up, get away from it, pick an option, stuff like that. Then you have what's called, in the front of the brain, the prefrontal cortex. So the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala need to kind of work together. It's almost like saying emotion and logic. When emotion and logic work together, you're more balanced. But remember how we talked about that the brain is not just one thing, it's almost like 3 different levels or tiers to it, different communication. An important factor is also that the brain develops in layers. So if you can imagine the brain developing in layers, first come, first serve. What I mean by that is if you have a friend that you've always relied on, who has kept you alive for the most part, and then you get a new friend that comes in and kind of tells you a little bit of different information, most of the time you're going to rely on that older friend. That older friend is the amygdala. So the amygdala is a very impulsive part of the brain. But it's necessary and it's there. It also creates anxiety, but it's necessary and it's there to keep us alive for survival purposes. Then later on, what we sometimes refer to as the prefrontal cortex, that kind of grows later on in life. And this is what we talk about every now and then when we say your brain hasn't finished developing yet. When we talk to young adolescents and we say you're 18, you're kind of still impulsive, you're black and white kind of thinking, you're not centered yet and stuff. This part of the brain, 25, 30 years old, it still keeps developing. So if my brain starts off for survival purposes being impulsive, and you got to be quick to react to something, then later on down the road, this other part of the brain comes in and goes, hey, can we slow things down a little bit? Can we talk about things before we react so quickly? It's a realignment. There's an adjustment that needs to occur. So more times than not, it's you got to stop and intentionally use energy, which the brain doesn't like doing. But the more and more that we're able to pause and reflect and not react so quickly and be impulsive, the more and more this part of the brain almost has equal say-so now. It kind of balances each other out. And this part goes, hey, I thought if I ignored you because I've been keeping us alive for so long, but now that I'm kind of listening to you, I actually think that we can survive even more together and excel. And you're actually a good part of me. So we got the thalamus and the hypothalamus kind of communicate. We have the amygdala, which is very impulsive, and it's kind of like that fight freeze thing. And then we have the prefrontal cortex, which is like the logic. Another little side note, just to kind of add to the impulsiveness of it, as well as the hologram and the projections that happen. We also have this part of our brain. Memory is throughout, but we have this part of the brain called the hippocampus. The hippocampus and the amygdala sit right next to each other. So we are emotional, and that's how we create a memory. So your brain is designed in a way to remember what was possibly life-threatening and harmful. So, because that's the part that was threatening your life. It remembers things, but it doesn't necessarily remember or feel an urge to remember the good things that happened. So your brain's constantly like a pessimistic friend that's kind of like, look out for danger, look out for danger, look out for danger, look out for danger. This prefrontal cortex helps balance it. So when the amygdala is talking to the hippocampus and storing memories and being like, remember, we almost died. Don't do that again. Remember all this stuff. The prefrontal steps in and goes, yeah, but there's other things too. Slow it down a little bit. Let's remember the entirety of the story and not just bits and pieces. Remember the entire book, and don't just remember the one notion or the narrative that you walked away with, which we are designed to do. After something happens, you don't remember everything about it, but you'll remember the emotion you left with, and you'll place either something good or bad on that. And that's your amygdala talking to your hippocampus. So even, for example, this video. We may not remember all the information that's been said in this video, but after it's done and we close it up and so forth, or we jump to the next video, whatever it may be, you remember a certain emotion that that video gave you. Either it made you think a little bit, or you're like, I didn't like that video, or I liked it. That's it. That's your narrative. That's your inside little scoop to generalize, to give it a good stamp or an impression of all this time that passed. We give a thumbs up or a thumbs down, then we kind of move forward from there. So that's your amygdala and your hippocampus kind of talking. We'll get into more parts of the brain. I just wanted to say those parts just so you don't have to just necessarily listen to me and take my, you can empower yourself, do some research and stuff, because I'm very, very oversimplifying the brain right now. There's a lot more that goes into it. That's our video for today. As always, thanks for watching. Appreciate it. And if you like the video, great. Thanks.